Thank you. Well, thank you again for having me here. I'm sorry it's on a Saturday, but I hope I'll entertain you. I'm not going to read from this, but I need some mental notes because I tend to speak too much. Please remind me 10 minutes to the point. So I want to specify something about this topic that I chose for this talk with you today. And I know there's no Q&A, but what I am going to share with you it's an opinion. It's something that I have comes out of my life and experience, and it will be about my life and experience, the 17 years I've spent in China and working a lot in Asia, although then at a certain point shifting the conversation a little bit more from the Asian perspective, out back here. So it's an opinion, it's an informed opinion. I'm actually a sinologist, I'm an Asian art historian, so that's where my story started. But it's not a definitive solution, but I think there is something we all have to start thinking really hard and seriously about, which connects back to some things that Louis just mentioned, which is about value versus values with in plural. And interestingly, this conversation started earlier this year in April during Salone del Mobile. So here we go back to growing conscience into the system. And it was a conversation entitled Design and the Common Good, with no sense of really taking that into a specific agenda. But I was lucky enough to be the moderator of a conversation that I had Paola Antonelli from MoMA, Ilse Crawford, one of the designers that also works with Luis and Fatima, and the designers of Forma Fantasma. So it was kind of a very interesting, group of people active, around the topic in very different capacities and in different ways. And somehow that is what I want to talk to you about on the basis of my experience of what that means and seen from the vantage point of China and that context. So at the end of 2012, I became the creative director of Beijing Design Week. And that was really a turning point in my life because, it was a big responsibility. Design Week still exists. Not sure what they do now, but it still exists. It's a very large-scale governmental event, so supported by the municipality of Beijing and 3 national ministries. And customarily, they had started, the event actually just a couple of years before. Well, with the idea that they actually needed a design week. So they didn't really know what to do with it. They knew that they had to create a platform for design at large. So it was my responsibility, to decide what to do with it. So what and why would a city like Beijing, a megalopolis like that, really be into the business, and what a design week would mean for it. And so thinking about that and consider the context of 2012, it was 2012, and a city that really had no industry for it. So, but it was, fashionably a term that everyone could, relate to. Design weeks, are plenty and around the world and are mostly built around a fair, dedicated to the industry. So that was my question. What do I do with it? Is it a good idea to build a platform that really starts from the commercial sector? Is it, or what else can I create that makes sense for the city? And what else can I create that really makes sense around asking the right questions about the relevance of design, for a city like Beijing, which is the cultural capital of China, filled with universities, filled so with students and future practitioners. So that question was really pivotal because I worked at Beijing Design Week for 4 years, and then after that I founded this institute, the Global School, which I'll talk a little bit about in a little bit. So for me, it was the point of asking the question of what's the relevance and what's the use of design, for a context like the one I was plugged into, and for a context that was really riddled with the complexities of the 21st century. So how was design, like connected to this transformation of like social, economic, and political nature? And looking at it from the vantage point of China, what kind of alternative scenario, could have been created really? In a sense of how these alternative scenarios could interrogate the role and positioning of design and designers in this ever more interdependent global context. So for me, of course, these implications were directly connected to the scale of this condition that we call globalization. And if anything, the emergence of Asia and China have been massive for the world at large, not just for the scale of its markets and the demographics simply. But for me, it was more about how these paradigms were starting to change really critically around definitions of value, of use, of usership, and particularly the role that different stakeholders played in their creation, in the policing and the management of such definition, which are heavily influenced and configured by different cultural factors and different notions of publicness, of collectivity, of values, and eventually of what really defines the common good. So this is a long preamble to explain you that I took my job really seriously. And so here we are. So why emergent behavior? Why I titled this emergent behavior. Actually, emergent behavior is a word, is a definition that comes from statistical science. And it really, that is the actual factual definition of it. So it is a feature of complex systems that represents, it really defines a collective outcome in which this system manifests itself as significantly different than basically the sum of its parts. So it means that it's the capacity of a system to survive without central control in forms of self-organization. And this is a characteristic of economies, of financial markets, of urban communities, of companies, and even organisms. So this comes really from the science of complexities. It's not a definition that I have, cooked out. So this is the capacity, basically, of a system to adapt and evolve in response to changing external conditions in a form of self-organization. So it's, by definition, a disruptive behavior. And so I started thinking that the history of design of the 20th century can sort of be looked at as a history of emergent behaviors, which is a history of disruptions. And so in this sense, designing becomes a responsive condition of complex systems in their attempt to adapt to the technological, social, and political configurations of a given time. And so if you think of it, you start from the beginning, like of the last century, you have, think of, the Black Mountain College, in the 20s and, early 30s. It was a community of individuals, that really advocated for radical collaborative practice, for the mixture of disciplines, going against the mainstream, essentially, of the time. And then, of course, the Bauhaus did exactly the same, and embodied for sure by like the teachings and the attitude of Molinage, like that is in that picture. But then we go ahead and we go into the 50s and the 60s of the hippie modernism, of alternatives, like countercultural groups, particularly based in the United States, and then we move ahead into the 1970s, like with the radical design, the radical Italian design that, so architects, designers at large really somehow responding, like to a predominant, like industrial culture and the post-war situation and conditions of society, to transit then into, like the conceptual design, the Dutch design, there is it was trying to kind of take a step back, like from the orthodoxy of the industry, and then the social design and the speculative, practices that are very much, in a sense, like what could represent an emergent behavior, of design in the present, and this accompanied by all sorts of like alternative forms of design courses that are now really present in any, like design or architectural school everywhere, for sure in Europe, think of Eindhoven, here in London as well. So, and then of course, I'm sure that, many of you know this book. If you don't, you should read it. It's a great book. I'm sure that me and Alice would have a great conversation about it. By the way, she was in this conversation as well in Milan in April. But essentially, this book that was published literally earlier this year, is a little bit a canon written about like where we are now. Where is this emergent behavior of design right now? And there is this interesting sentence there, as you see, that tries to, like describe what younger practitioners are doing nowadays, and to really pursue their social, political, and ecological goals by operating independently from the commercial system. And then here we go back again, like to this prototypical conversation that at every Salone, at every Milan Design Week, we are back into, like this sort of relentless attempt, of the industry to try to like elevate, the role of design and desire somewhere else. And but the reality is, this has happened recursively all along the history of the 20th century. So there we have it. This year, when we were having this conversation, and the reason why, for example, Paola was sitting on this panel, of course, like in Milan, is because she was the curator, the chief curator of the Triennale that was on, the Triennale, the exhibition, not the building, of broken nature, which was really advocating for this new direction of design is called restorative design. So design that really is made to kind of, care for the environment or the living ecosystem, that is not just made of humans anymore. We cannot think that way anymore through the anthropocentric, character of design, but can we design for non-humans? And then again, concomitant to it, quite the same period, actually, the Triennale in the Cooper Hubert, it's still on, titled the same way. And then again, museum, and perennial exhibitions that are, prototypically context, where thinking and practice really meet, where sort of discourse, like it's really articulated. Here on the left is, like the show dedicated to Victor Papanek, like that Vitra Museum organized. And of course, Papanek is one of, the prototypical example of the designers that wanted the design industry to grow a conscience. And the Istanbul Design Biennale last year was all about rethinking and probing once again, like the legacy of the Bauhaus. So all of this, and once again, I mean, I could put in here, like 20 slides about how many exhibitions, there have been about this, and this is an example of, how architecture, like, so in the realm of architecture, in the world of architecture, like curators, thinkers, intellectuals and practitioners are really questioning their role in the contemporary context, like in the perspective of, what can we do? How can we change the system of production and consumption? And is that really the place where we should enact change? So, again, this is really a momentous and very interesting period, like when practitioners themselves are asking the question, like within the system. So for me, this questioning, it's interesting because while I am part of these people, I am part of this, coterie of people that want to question, that want to find always, like broader horizons, like for us to be part of something. I also started asking how genuine is this infatuation that we have with the idea of design serving a higher, like moral role. And especially because this puts a pressure on what we understand nowadays being creativity and innovation. What is that for? And one version of it is this. The Moonshot Factory, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's essentially what Alphabet, Google, did for itself in terms of creating its own incubator. So the Moonshot Factory, it's a separate entity that actually behaves like a startup. So in a sense that it's really, and this is like really a screenshot from their website, it says, we approach projects that have the aspiration and riskiness of research with the speed and ambition of a startup. So the Moonshot Factory, it's a way basically in which Google kind of like uses its own resources and know-how. It's a prototypical laboratory where engineers, coders, artists, designers, all sorts of creative practitioners are put into a pool to do what? To save us and solve some of the world's hardest problems. So these are some of the projects that the Moonshot Factory, has spearheaded. And this is what Astro Teller, which by the way is the grandson of one of, Astro Teller's grandfather was one of, the father of the H-bomb. This is what he says. He said, we hope to find repeatable methods for delivering real impact to the world, developing technology products that provide the foundations of large, sustainable, new businesses. So this is the great and generous protectorate of Google. They are gonna give us, self-driving cars, they are going to change the way that we are, being delivered food. They will provide internet to, all of the sort of remotest regions in the world and energy for everyone. So the question is, if we, understand creativity innovation as being investment into the larger good, into the good, that is common to us all, who is profiting from really saving the world? And this is a very important question. And so here it's where it starts, like what I have witnessed and also what I have been a part of in my past 17 years. This is a company, you see the Chinese characters up there in that picture, it is Yole Go. This is a company called Yule. And it was founded in 2015-2016, and this is the collaboration of three major stakeholders. China Post, which is one of the largest and oldest governmentally owned companies in China, of course. The Tom Group, which is a Hong Kong-based enormous technological company that deals with everything from e-commerce platforms, so data-based businesses, and a Toronto-based cloud service. What it does, this Ule group, it essentially has leveraged and empowered the capillarity that China Post as a delivery system has all over the country, and this is the one that has the largest coverage compared to the Alibaba of the case or anything else that has come after it. Remember, China Post, it's actually a company that in its imperial version actually existed 200 years before. So this is like the largest infrastructure and delivery system in China. They have collaborated with these two other database technological groups to do what? To solve the issue that with pressing growth of cities and the coming of e-commerce platforms, like digitalization of everything that was service delivery of everyday common goods, these tiny stores in the remotest regions of the country were starting to lagging behind, and they were not only losing their job. This deterioration, was very much impacting the livelihood of these very local communities, these very small villages, sometimes made of 50, 100 people. So this intelligent alliance that a government-owned company with a gigantic, an investment-based, company in Hong Kong, and a cloud, based service company from Toronto did was to really put at best, their own tools to in fact improve a situation that neither, like the private sector alone, nor the public sector alone could have solved. And for me, this is inspiring. It is inspiring because, of course, this is also, in a way, impacting and changing the life of these people, but it's doing it so that they remain part of the productive system. So they are not either treated as charity, they are not either treated as, like secondary citizens, they are actually somehow re-empowered, repurposed into the system. So then going back to, like my work and this ambition that I set for themselves, I was asking a little bit to myself these questions. How can I use design? How can I use a very large public platform, a governmental platform, that could reach millions in the city of Beijing in a sort of elevating way? And this was my response at that time. I give you just an example. I think that what we succeeded in doing really at best was to try to match our outreach, so the fact that also communication-wise, public, the level of simple PR, as an event, as a cultural event, we could have reached anyone, literally, at least in Beijing. We started collaborating with a real estate developer, a state-owned company, partially a state-owned company, and a local community in this area of the city, which is called the Dashalar. As you can see here, this is like more or less is a 1 square kilometer. It's a 1 square kilometer, part of the city. It's really close to Tiananmen, so that you see, left there. It's a very unique part of the city. It was the cultural and commercial heart of Imperial China. It's where, like tea houses and theaters, where, so this is really like a dense, it's where a dense and very resilient community still lives. And it is right at the heart of Beijing city, pressed, by the rest, around itself. So what we did was we decided to work with these local constituencies, the local developer, the local, community services and etc., who had founded this Dash Lab, this laboratory that basically was a common table where citizens and representatives of the community, and imagine that these are really resilient community with really long-lasting, communities there. So people that have been living there for generations, like since imperial times, and having to live with the modernization of Beijing pumping, around itself. So plenty of issues, abated this part of town, particularly the fact that was architecturally or urbanistically really just not ready to take in the modern world. So what we did, we started to collaborate with them, and we set up a system where using this, cadence of 1 year when Beijing Design Week was happening, rather than just concentrating all our effort, in simply having exhibitions, like contemporary pop-ups and etc., we worked all year round on given topics that really were problematic for the city. We had, and on our side, we brought in the creativity and intelligence, that came from the design sector. And this resulted in many years in this program called the Dashalar Pilot Program, where literally every year we would have, co-designed together with Dashalar, the Dashalar program, a set of briefs that then we would have shared with designer, with architects, creative creative engineers and etc., to respond to the needs of this context. What came out was not simply for show, for installation purpose. The idea was that this time would have allowed us to really create, in a way, to incubate ideas that could have truly have an impact, for that system. And really elective examples, and case studies came out of it. And I'm showing this only this one. There were plenty more, but it's just to give you an idea. This was an architecture studio that was based in the Hutongs, and what they decided to work with was the problem of housing. So, which is the one that is the most impactful, of course, in the area. These houses are like hundreds of years old. Most of the, mostly they don't have any foundation. They don't have insulation. They don't have toilets, because courtyard houses were not built so, in imperial times. So, but the problem is, of course, what do? Do you demolish and rebuild? Costly. Problematic for the living the residents, because it removes from the community system that really sustains them, and renovation equally costly, equally difficult. Who pays for it? So they devised this system called the plug-in system. You see it here is quite clearly. Basically, is a proprietary paneling system that includes everything. So this paneling system, first of all, can be assembled in basically less than 2 days. So an entire house can assembled in 2 days. But this is not a prefab house. This is a system that allows intervention just where it's needed. And it can be assembled very simply. And this was the very first prototype, but it's quite simple. It's quite, this picture is quite good. It shows you exactly what it does. So it's plugging into an existing, house or beneath, and it just, inserts itself. You see this picture on the left, right? It's quite clear. You see the paneling behind, like the original structure. And this provides everything. Then it's a way to have, the wiring, the plumbing, and the toilet, within the house itself. So what happened is that then, and this is it in action, actually, as a single, individual living unit. So this is the condition of Hutongs, right? This is really what Hutongs are about. But the problem of relocation is difficult. And people don't want to leave places where they have lived for a generation. And so the outcome of this pilot program actually became a reality, in a sense that the architecture studio was really collaborating with this locally based, governmental developer, and they, together with residents, they really wanted and wanted change and upgrade their houses. They were sharing the costs. This system is extremely cost effective, so something that actually local residents could afford. But as of last year, and these are just examples. So as you can also see, the system is really flexible. It allows, to respond to the given condition of the sites, which are often, really tight environments, where lighting issues are a problem. So and then residents started to really, adopt it. So last year, this project, in fact, was acquired in a way, or not acquired, sorry, it was funded. The architecture office was funded by a social entrepreneurship foundation, a Chinese organization. And what they are doing now is they are really deploying this system, this intelligent system, all around China, in places that have, that meet, very similar conditions. These are photos, for example, this one is, on the left is down in Shenzhen. There are others in rural areas. As you can see them, some have been completely, built anew, again, like, in these rural villages. And it became, and it has really and truly sort of like become a collaboration where different constituencies contributed, to a farther end. So what I did then with this first, example, and project program that we had, we then were contacted by another part, district in Beijing, which is this one, that is circled in red, up there on the left. So another Hutong area, similar context, but very different problems. And this is just some of the characteristics of this area. Beautiful area, but very different. So Beijing has this characteristic of really having, particularly Hutongs, like a really different, like the social conditions, like a side of like the urban or architectural similarity in social formation. They are extremely different. So there are different common needs, you know, like according to each of them. And so this was still Beijing Design Week. We started our collaboration with the local developer, because he really wanted to understand how he could really approach, you know, like similar problems. Like actually the problem here was really fast depopulation because of the pressure that, again, you know, like this area lived being adjacent to basically what's the financial district of Beijing and shopping areas. So the problem is that being hutongs, you know, like areas that are not well equipped, you know, like to really hosting, you know, like especially younger people, the area was rapidly being depopulated, and it suffered all sorts of other problems, of course, you know, given to its architectural, you know, condition. So the issue was that this sense of collectivity in a way, and this sense of co-owning, you know, like the area that it's really been, you know, a characteristic, you know, of these tight communities was deteriorating fastly. And so this is what we decided to do. We decided to recreate, retest once again, reopen up the area to own its own spaces, to really once again, you know, recreate that sense of like codependence, you know, like and productive you know, like coexistence that was, you know, like a community like this. So this was an old market, a food market that in fact, because of Beijing regulations, you know, like was shut down. All of, you know, like food markets within the second ring road, which is the old town essentially, have been shut down since now like 4 or 5 years. But the space was there. So what to do with a space of that kind? As you can see, you know, like it was a dormitory. It was partially used as a dormitory for some of the workers, you know, that were active there. But so what we wanted to test was how do we recreate, you know, like the space in a way that the community really recognizes itself in it once again. Because, you know, like the food market was the place where they would meet every day and chit chat and gossip, you know, but it was really the only area, the only space within this entire district where, you know, they could actually practice public life. And it was taken from them. So we managed, together with the local developer and the local district government, to actually reopen this food market temporarily, to allow us to test how we could have, you know, opened up in the future a long-term space to help the actual urban and social regeneration of the entire area. So these were really example of really elective collaborations that came from different stakeholders sitting at the same table. And it was really fun. What we did in the beginning, because of course this was not a permanent intervention, we actually opened a temporary space of creation for socializing and for education, which was called the Global School. So I kind of incubated my own business in a way while doing, you know, like this, while opening up this cultural platform. And these are examples. Like, so what we did was we really kind of just stripped bare, you know, like the space. We didn't really change anything. We kept a lot of this local, you know, of this characteristic, the tiles, you know, like this plinths were there, you know, you can imagine there, that's where they were selling, you know, like their, you know, fruit and vegetables. But so what happened is that this became a very natural, you know, space for the local residents to walk in. You know, you always have this problem. You want to intervene, you know, like, and bring your cool pop-up show, you know, like in just a nice space or a derelict space, because it's going to make your stuff look good. I have never done that. We have never done that. Everything that we did in this space was based on previous months' research that we did with Tsinghua University, with students from architecture and urbanism departments about the entire area. Everything that was on show, in fact, was somehow related to the area. It was sort of proposition ideas that designers, students, architects were coming up with, responding to what they had seen there, but also over months of conversation. And so it became really, once again, a very open and public place. You see these ladies, with their grocery stores, their grocery, going around, and we had workshops, we had public events, and these were interestingly always a mixture of residents, of local residents, and urbanists. We had like the director of the Beijing Urban Bureau speaking there together with very well-known architects and local residents. So we organized this project, called I Live in Baitas. Baitas is the name of this Hutong district, where literally, planners and those that live in the plan of those that plan, were, confronting, each other. And this never really happened before. So what I mean is that we were really trying to find a better way to deploy, like the means and capacity of what we define as creativity and innovation, but not in this abusive relationship that it commanded between I am commissioning you something, and you are doing it for me. We were really trying to kind of manipulate, to actually change and reconfigure the way that all of the stakeholders that are involved in the system really talk and work with each other. And this took a long time. It wasn't always successful, but it was completely worth it. These are just some pictures, and I have only 10 minutes, and I'm far from being finished, but I quickly want to give you some other examples of what I just described you, because this is, for me, this is the lesson I learned from spending so much time in the context of China. This is the Digua community. Is just to, once again, to give you quick examples. It's a project that was started by a designer called Zhang Zizhu. He discovered that Beijing is rich with abandoned underground spaces, which were once designed during the Mao era as part of their defense policy for security. They were basically like bomb shelters, and that had been then reused and rebuilt once again during the 90s, and then they were completely disbanded because this had become like literally underground cities. People lived there, migrants were living there. They had cinemas, they had shops, but then they were completely disbanded. But there is a gigantic reservoir of this in the whole of Beijing, and not only Beijing. What he did, he decided to actually make use of these leftover spaces and turn them into spaces for the community that were both co-programmed and managed by the residents above ground. So Beijing is, really hardly lacking, of public spaces. Quality public life is really difficult, also because of like commuting hours, new lifestyles that are brought about, like by the hyper speed of modernization. So this way of dealing with communal spaces was really to use the tools of design to really, through processes, if you want, of design thinking, really collaborate with residents, with local residents, but so that they would contribute to the project. And so this has now become a project he has been developing in different cities, not just in Beijing. This is an example of another one. So often these spaces, in fact, they sit within building blocks, like high rises that were particularly built during the 80s and the 90s. So they, by nature, they already have a community of residents there. And once again, these are collaborations that are made with different stakeholders there. You cannot use, these spaces if you don't have an access to it, or you make, like a good, provide a good decision for it. This is another one that actually touches upon, a different way in which designers really reposition the SEMP within the system. They have, these independent designers have 3 of them actually. They have over 10 years developed the program, to systematize, catalog, archive, craft and technologies and traditional technologies of China's 32 provinces into a design library. This they have done alone. This is the job that a museum should do. There's none of it in China, I can assure you. They have worked on this for 10 years. They have, brought together all of these materials. They have organized a series, set of residency programs where they have other designers coming in, and they're actually working as mediators between the craftsmen that, of course, and normally always live a little bit in this reclusive, and very protective environment of not being willing to be, too engaged, by newcomers. So they act really as mediators. And this work has been eventually I'm simplifying a bit the process because we don't have time. But what I mean to say is that they have been able to sort of actually really change and reconfigure the way the system works. This place, this library, is actually based in an old 1960s communal theater that they were given by the city village of Yuhang, which is in fact the city government that has deployed, that has commissioned them to help them preserving the crafts, and the heritage of the area, because this is a very rich area in all sorts of first natural materials, bamboo, so wood, and crafts of different sorts. They have an online archive. They have invited, so these are just pictures from the place. They have an online archive that you can see on the website if you're curious, but it is an immense work. But in itself, it has slowly then grown to become a self-sustainable system. But it has also changed the way that these different actors deal with such heritage. So in conclusion, and I think I'm over time already, what did I learn from this? I think that what I showed you in the beginning with, the Moonshot Factory, the prototypical example of how we understand creativity and innovation today is this. It's radical creativity. So it's about, the closed door, lab work, secretive work of a bunch of individuals. They really try to develop forms of breakthrough invention, something that solves a big problem that is scalable, at the utmost power. And they are generally based on disrupting systems. This is what the 21st century, has been all about. And finding vertical solutions, to large-scale problems. Instead, what I'd like to think of, and where we are going, is something else, which is called I call practical creativity. So something that fosters a form of perpetual innovation in a kind of fashion that I would call everyday science. And it's about, rather than disrupting system, it's about consolidating alliances, and it's about responding to imminent common issues and that can have an effect in a form of distributed empowerment. And so this is what I have been doing and what the Global School, it's all about, the institute that I have founded. And it is an educational institution that though really works with practice-based forms of learning and that tries to tap into these possibilities to reconfigure the systems and how really all of the stakeholders in the system talk to each other. And I think they have done.